and welcome to this special podcast for 4 Minutes to Zero, the brand new mystery thriller novel written by Dr. Colin Barron. My name is Tom Christie. I am an independent researcher and author based in central Scotland, and it's a pleasure to be joined today by the author of 4 Minutes to Zero, Dr. Colin Barron himself.
Thank you, Tom.
So Colin, 4 Minutes to Zero is your fourth novel, but it's also your first sequel. What made you decide to write a sequel, and what pitfalls were you aware of?
The suggestion that I could write a sequel came from my publisher. At the end of my previous novel, 24 Hours to Doomsday, my protagonist, Rick Fernscale, narrowly escapes death. At one point I had decided to kill him off at the end of that book, but then changed my mind. So I thought that it might be interesting to continue Rick's story a year later, because the terrorist organisation, The Seven, was seriously weakened by Rick's actions, but not totally destroyed. Obviously, the easy option would have been to write a story very similar to the first. But what I did instead was devise a story that used the same dramatic formula as 24 Hours to Doomsday, but with a different content. So the plot formula I used was one which was described by author Kurt Vonnegut as man in whole. And this is best illustrated by this graph, which shows how the hero's fortunes vary with time. The main point is that the book starts with the protagonist on top of the world. Life could not be better. Then his world falls apart in minutes. He loses everything he cherishes and cannot see a way forward. And everything he does to put things right make things worse. And then just when things are the worst they can possibly be, he pulls a rabbit out the hat. Things change rapidly and he finds himself better off than before. The best illustration of this story structure comes not from a book, but from a well-known film, Hitchcock's North by Northwest. If you remember that film, Tom, it begins with the protagonist Roger Thorndyke, played by Cary Grant, arriving at the United Nations building in New York. A man is murdered. Somehow the innocent Thorndyke gets the blame and goes on the run. Thorndyke loses everything. He gets into various scrapes. Then about a minute before the end of the film, his new love Eve, played by Eve Marie Saint, is hanging by her fingertips from the edge of a cliff on Mount Rushmore. She's about to fall. Thorndyke will lose everything he has gained. Against all the odds, he manages to pull her up to safety, and the next scene then shows him pulling Eve, now his new wife, onto the upper bunk of a train sleeper compartment. This scene presumably takes place a few months later. So 4 Minutes to Zero is a bit like this. It doesn't have the classic one wave of Vonnegut's man in whole structure. Instead, it has a second wave, as you can see from this graph. And if you want to see how this has been done, you'll have to read the book. Essentially, Rick has a series of objectives in the book. He has to carry out a risky mission for the terrorists in order to save Maria's life. He then has to find a way of stopping the terrorist plans to destroy the world as we know it. He faces a series of obstacles which he has to overcome. And it is this constant raising of hopes and then dashing them that makes the book so addictive and puts the reader on an emotional roller coaster. Is Rick going to live, or is he going to die? Are the terrorists going to succeed, or will they fail? Will Rick ever be reunited with Maria and find happiness again? Hopes are continually raised and then dashed. Right up to the last few sentences of the book, I continually confound readers' expectations about what is going to happen. And that is what makes an interesting read.
Now, my next question concerns the title. How important is this, do you think, in making people want to read the book?
I think the title is very important. My first Rick Fernscale book was called 24 Hours to Doomsday. So for the sequel, I wanted a title which again suggested a race against time, a ticking time bomb if you like. I quickly ruled out another 24 Hours to Doomsday or 48 Hours to Doomsday as being too obvious and cliched, although that is probably what they would have done if it was a Hollywood film. I decided that the word zero should be in the title and considered a number of possibilities such as zero option or the zero option, 0 hour, the 0 hour, the zero protocol and countdown to zero. But I soon discovered that all these titles had already been used for books and films. 0 Hour, for example, was the title of a very serious airliner in trouble movie which formed the inspiration for the 1980 comedy Airplane. The title The Zero Option has an interesting history. After the TV series The Professionals ended in 1983, London Weekend Television was looking for a similar replacement, and in 1989 they screened a series called Saracen, which only ran for one season. It was a flop, but the pilot episode was titled The Zero Option. Titles are something which a lot of authors struggle with. You might think that if a title was used for a book or film, or even for a song, then it would never be used again. Nothing could be further from the truth. There are currently 2 different books on Amazon with the title Countdown to Zero. There was a thriller by Desmond Bagley called Running Blind, which was made into a 1979 BBC Scotland TV movie. Running Blind is also the title of a Lee Child novel. Even the Bond movies with their huge budgets and multiple writers have this problem. The most recent Bond movie was originally to be called Shatterhand, but was changed to the rather cliched No Time to Die. Not only is it a weak title, it isn't even original. The 1958 Warwick Films production Tank Force had a different title in the USA, which was No Time to Die. There's a similar problem in the world of pop music. There have been 3 different pop songs with the title Fox on the Run, and in the early 80s there were 3 completely different pop songs in the charts which all had the same title, namely The Power of Love. Back in the 60s, the Dave Clark 5 had 2 hits a few years apart which had the same title, Everybody Knows, but they were completely different songs. On the other hand, I've always been interested in punchy, original titles. Back in 1978, when I was editor of Surgo, Glasgow University Medical Journal, I received an article called Medical Unemployment. I changed the title to the more punchy and alliterative Doctors on the Dole, and this title has been used by many newspapers and media outlets ever since. Then in 1996, I wrote an article for the Glasgow Herald about the missing Doctor Who episodes and their recovery. I gave it the title Raiders of the Lost Archives. This title has been used many times since in TV, radio and print, as you can see from this recent cutting, but I believe I was the first person to come up with it.
A piece of advice that is often given to new writers is that they should write about what they know rather than what they don't know. Do you agree with this? And can you give me some examples from your latest book?
I think this is good advice. And if you look at the content of my latest book, you will find many examples. Much of the action in the first half takes place in Cyprus and then Israel. I've been on holiday to Cyprus 6 times and even got married there. So I'm very familiar with the climate, the cuisine, the topography and the continuing British influence. For example, They drive on the left in Cyprus and use British-style 3-pin electricity sockets. I'm also very familiar with Israel. My father was Jewish, and so I'm familiar with Jewish cuisine, which is mentioned in the book. I'm also aware of the effectiveness of the Israeli military. Despite having a relatively small population, Israel makes a lot of its own armaments, including light naval vessels, aircraft, missiles, and even tanks. They produce a very effective tank called the Merkava, which features in the book. It is one of the best protected tanks in the world, with great emphasis on crew survivability. It even has a front-mounted engine to provide additional protection for the crew, plus a compartment at the rear which can hold 4 infantrymen. Some of the action in the book even takes place in Eilat, which I visited twice. I've even mentioned the King Solomon's Palace Hotel, where Sylvester Stallone stayed while making Rambo 3 in 1987. That's where I stayed when I was on holiday in Eilat in March 1988. The author Frederick E. Smith once travelled to Norway in the mid-50s to do some research for his first 633 Squadron book. However, nowadays you can find almost any piece of information you want on the internet, particularly street maps. If you have a street map in front of you, you can create a very convincing description of your protagonist's journey through a distant town or city. And this was a tip I picked up from reading about how Frederick Forsyth wrote his novels. He always found street maps very useful.
Your book also includes a chapter set in Northern Ireland in 1988, which features the hero's father, Jack Fernscale, and gives us a bit of backstory about one of the book's villains, former IRA man Sean Docherty. Did you find it difficult to write that chapter?
Not at all. I greatly enjoyed writing that chapter. I've always liked dramas about the troubles in Northern Ireland, and in my opinion, the best 2 fiction books on this topic have been Harry's Game and its sort of sequel, Field of Blood, both written by former ITN journalist and novelist Gerald Seymour. Harry's Game was made into a TV movie starring Ray Lonan in 1982, and Field of Blood became a straight-to-video and DVD release in 1997, with the title changed to The IRA Informant, and with a screenplay by Nicholas Meyer, who scripted 3 Star Trek movies, including The Wrath of Khan. One interesting thing about that production is that it featured a post-Bond Timothy Dalton as Inspector Rennie, the only character who also appeared in Harry's Game, albeit played by a different actor. Dalton only appears in the movie for a few minutes and is a relatively minor character. Despite this, Dalton appears on the DVD box art in a kind of Bond pose, with his right hand holding a pistol against his left shoulder. It looked like the producers were trying to capitalise on his past Bond roles as a way of selling the DVD. However, both these books and their TV adaptations are hugely enjoyable, and I found that when I was writing this Northern Ireland flashback chapter, I channeled my inner Gerald Seymour, trying to paint a word picture of the damp, depressing world of Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s.
Your book features a few expletives. What's your view on the use of profanity in a novel? Does it alienate the reader, or do you think it makes the book seem more gritty?
Well, my book does feature a few uses of the F word towards the end when stakes are running high. But in my view, this contributes to the realism of the book. I'm not a sweary person myself, but when people are under great stress and also feeling angry, they are likely to unleash a string of expletives. If you are a soldier and you have to kill the villain to save the world and your gun jams, you're not going to just say, "Oh dear, my gun is jammed. What am I going to do?" You're going to unleash a string of expletives. Attitudes towards swearing have changed. Back in 1958, the original script for Ice Cold and Alex had John Mills' character, Captain Anson, using the word bloody a few times. But this was too much for the censors, so the word was changed to ruddy. And that's why he goes on about the beer in a bar in Alexandria being ruddy cold. Just 3 years later, the world had moved on. You may remember Richard Harris as squadron leader Barnesford at the very beginning of the Guns of Navarone. He uses the word bloody several times. Nowadays, bloody wouldn't even be considered a swear word. However, the F word and the C word are still considered too strong to be used in broadcast television, at least before the 9 p.m. watershed. If you look at most soap operas like Corrie, EastEnders and Emmerdale, a lot of the scenes consist of people screaming at each other. In real life, this dialogue would be peppered with expletives, but they can't use them in these programmes because of broadcasting rules. Similarly, soldiers swear a lot when in a combat situation, but this has rarely been depicted in war movies because it would affect the film's certificate and reduce its potential audience. That's the reason why Jack Bauer constantly uses the word damn it in episodes of 24, because he can't use the F word in broadcast television. So to answer your question, yes, I have used expletives a few times in the book, but I have used them sparingly and only in extremely stressful situations.
It's said there are two types of novel writers, plotters and pantsers. Which are you?
Before I wrote my first novel, Operation Archer, I would have thought I would have been a plotter, with the entire plot worked out in advance of writing the novel. In practice, though, I am more of a pantser, meaning that I write by the seat of my pants. I simply take my protagonist, put him in a difficult situation, and see what develops. When I wrote the first chapter of my latest book, for example, I had no idea what was going to happen in the following chapter. But when I got to that point, something occurred to me, and so on, and so on. A lot of writers work this way. The analogy is often given is with driving a car at night. You can only see about 50 feet in front of you, but you still get to your destination, even if it is 50 miles away. Yet when you look at 4 minutes to zero, you might think that I had all been plotted in advance. In fact, I didn't even know what the baddie's master plan was until I got to that chapter. I think the reason why I can't conceive of the entire plot of a book prior to writing is because of the well-known observation that the conscious mind can only hold a maximum of 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, whereas the unconscious has almost unlimited storage capacity. So my unconscious mind knew the entire plot, but my conscious mind did not.
And finally, Colin, it would be remiss of me not to ask, you've now written 2 books featuring Rick Fernscale. Do you think there's going to be a third?
Well, for there to be a third, then Rick would have to survive the second book. And it's not looking too promising, Tom. 3 chapters before the end of the book, Rick falls 100 feet into the sea with 2 bullets in his body. And the last chapter of the book is called Rick Fernscale R.I.P. and features his funeral. His obituary appears in the Times, so it's hard to see how Rick could have survived. But in the world of fiction, anything can happen, and it frequently does, so who knows?
Well, Colin, thanks very much for joining us today to talk about your new book. I'm sure that the listeners will want to join me in searching for it on Amazon and other participating online retailers, so they can find out for themselves the many twists and turns that face Rick in his latest adventure. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
Don't forget that 4 Minutes to Zero is available to buy now, online and anywhere that sells good books.